Hello, OOSKA users. Today we welcome John Matthews, who heads up AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. Viewers may be familiar with John. He writes an occasional guest column for OOSKAnews on the nexus of global water challenges and the world climate discourse. But perhaps you could take a moment, John, and describe yourself and the function of AGWA to our viewers.
Sure, and thank you, David. I am the lead for a group called the AGWA Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. By training, I'm a scientist, an aquatic ecologist. An AGWA, as a global network of about 1,400 people, is mostly made up of other types of water professionals: engineers, economists, finance, other types of scientists, governance specialists. And together we work on how to develop the next generation of best practices around resilient water management. And as part of that, we also recognize that in order to do good resilient water management, we need to be able to communicate the emerging needs and conditions that policy can either help facilitate or in some cases make much more difficult. So we have a strong policy program. There are about 300 or 400 people inside of the AGWA network that are directly involved in that policy work, and most of us have some kind of a technical orientation. And for maybe 6 years or so, we've sent a delegation to the UNFCCC COPs.
Now, so you're somewhat a veteran of the world climate discourse, pre and post the landmark Paris Agreement. From a water perspective, you must have seen many changes.
Absolutely. The first COP that I attended was COP 15, which was Copenhagen in, I believe, 2009. And my favorite story about Copenhagen was I met one representative from the 600-strong Brazilian delegation, and he said, I am the only person representing or tracking water as an issue out of that 600 people. And there's been a profound shift over the last 10 years or so. And now water is much more present. There's been events since Paris in 2015 and Marrakesh the year right after. There has been a very strong water presence. Water has been defined as a kind of distinct and important discourse. I think most of the countries, most of the national parties, many of the NGOs and civil society, and the UNFCCC itself recognize that water is very critical to how we think about climate adaptation, and making sure that we're recognizing the threats that are related to water and also the potential solutions associated with water. And now we're starting to also see, I think, a broader recognition that water plays a really strong role in climate mitigation as well. So how we think about new energy solutions, how some of the new choices that we might be making to lower our carbon emissions or sequester carbon even actually are quite water intensive, and we might need to rebalance some of our water resources at a national and subnational level.
And that's relatively new to a layman who is aware of climate change challenges. The headlines that one reads relate to carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, and what can be done to mitigate climate change, while water plays a role in mitigation exercises and planning. The recognition of climate change not being so much imminent, but it's with us now, has, I have the impression, led to a greater awareness among players of adaptation measures, and it's already happening. What are we going to do about it? Because where climate change rubber hits the road is all about water.
Absolutely. I like to think in a way of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement in particular as potentially the first global water agreement, even though it doesn't even mention water. And water plays still a relatively small role in the UNFCCC framework processes. And that's because on the adaptation side, most of the choices that we're making are about infrastructure for disasters, for thinking about long-term sustainability for cities and agriculture. That's all about water. When we think about new energy sources, there is as much in terms of volume water that is used to generate a kilowatt hour of hydropower electricity as there is for coal-fired electricity. And water is important for really all of the renewable resources except for wind and a couple of types of solar generation, but nuclear, biofuels, hydropower, pretty much everything else is really water intensive. So if we're not really thinking about water as not as a sector, but as a kind of cross-cutting theme across the convention, how as we shift economies from one type of water consumption to another type of water consumption, if we don't think very consciously about where's that water coming from, what kinds of trade-offs do we need to make, then we can actually put ourselves into a world of hurt, and we might not be able to meet the larger climate goals that we have.
Most recently, I know you attended the Convention of Parties, the most recent one in Katowice, Poland, and wrote a piece for OOSKAnews, which we will link to for our readers and viewers. I have the piece in front of me. I detected that your view was that there were good things happening in Katowice, some frustrations, but a particular frustration being that there are some entities, people, parties who have not yet are not yet coming to the water table, or not yet appreciating how intrinsic the water conversation is to any discourse about climate.
That's unfortunately true. You called me a veteran earlier. I might prefer like a silverback gorilla at this point with the climate discussions, and that's having that longer term perspective from being not even a kind of rounding error in 2009 to where we are now is helpful, and you see progress over time. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still obstacles. So the piece that I wrote about included a story. I had been asked on behalf of AGWA to provide input to a roundtable session as a formal part of the UNFCCC discussions that were meant to advise a high-level group of government ministers on climate finance. And there were about 40 people sitting around the table. I definitely felt like, even though normally I would call myself an overdressed biologist, I was definitely the underdressed finance person at the table, and I was the only sectoral person. Most of the other people were with groups that either manage large funds. State comptroller from New York State, representing many billions of dollars in pension funds, for instance, was there. There were the large investment houses and development banks that were around the table. A few NGOs that work on trying to promote climate mitigation and labeling, things like green bonds, climate bonds were there. But I was the only person representing a sector, and I, of the 40 people, I was maybe number 20 or 21 in the lineup of speakers. So I had a good chance to kind of gauge the kinds of interventions that were being made. And I started off and I said, mostly what we've been hearing about is that there is a quantity issue around climate finance. So we need more climate finance, and it needs to be mostly focused on climate mitigation. We need to label the money that we're spending for climate finance for mitigation. We've heard a little bit about climate adaptation. I'd like to represent a counter opinion that there's actually a quality issue here. That if we don't think about how we're managing water in a really sustainable way through finance processes, that we may actually not be getting what we paid for. And I use the example of energy, and that some of the large dams that have been put around the world to create clean energy, especially in the developing world right now, which is a very aggressive, rapid process. If anything, an accelerating process right now. Many of the investments that people had mentioned before me were along these lines. Now, I was saying, if we haven't thought carefully about are these mitigation investments really resilient from a water perspective, then we won't really be getting what we need, both from an economic development perspective and a climate policy perspective. And I was literally cut off. So the guy turned off my microphone, and he said that these points are not relative to a finance discussion. And I'd like to think that is an exception. You know, there were people who came up to me afterwards and said those are important points that you were making. I'm sure I could have made them better, but I think the larger issue is there's still some headway that we need to make. I think those of us in the water community understand that water and climate are profoundly linked. And when you think about the lifetime of water infrastructure investment, it's many decades, and it could be even centuries. And so we need to think about how to sustain water resources in our economies over that kind of a time scale. And that's not a time scale that the finance community in particular is comfortable with. That they haven't really done that very often in the past. So I have faith that we will make progress. I think the water community is a kind of wave inside of the UNFCCC. And we're a growing wave, if anything.
Looking forward, you sound optimistic, but the global climate discourse has had some hiccups with the US withdrawal, and more recently Brazil's new ambiguity towards recognition of climate change challenges. There's going to be a new COP in 2019. What changes do you see happening broadly for the climate change discourse, but also water's place in the conversation?
Really good questions. So in terms of a process, these COPs are normally about 12 days, and there's a kind of neat division that happens in terms of their typical rhythm. There's the first week is usually more content oriented in terms of really good briefings and kind of building momentum. You have more civil society involved, and second week is often when the more high level people from the national parties come in, where if there are difficult decisions to be made at that COP, where a lot of the more challenging negotiation happens. And on a good COP, when you feel like there's positive things that are happening that first week, you will be hearing lots of reports from the national parties about progress. And I'd say that this COP was really challenged that first week. Most of the comments that I was hearing from colleagues who were negotiators were not at all good. Then they often felt very frustrated that little progress was occurring. And part of it was kind of bizarre things by the U.S. government promoting coal, so-called clean coal. And immediately before the COP, as you also alluded, Brazil withdrew its offer to host the COP next year, or I guess this year, in November. And that's a big loss. That it's even possible, there are rumors that Brazil may be reconsidering its relationship with the UNFCCC along the same lines that the U.S. has done. So that was definitely concerning and frustrating. There's also, I was talking to a member of the UNFCCC who's a good colleague, and he's from Bhutan, and he said that one of the things that you have to remember with the COP is that you also just have to let the negotiators sit with each other, and actually progress will happen. You don't necessarily always see what will happen. You can't predict it frequently, but it will occur. And that has been a consistent pattern over the UNFCCC's history. It is a warranted faith. And in this case, the second week also turned out to be pretty challenging when the actual negotiators showed up. The second week, there was still, even with cabinet ministers present, even a few heads of state, there was still a sense of frustration. The COP actually lasted about another 36 or extra 48 hours. And the reason the kind of main sticking points were around what do the wealthier countries that are historically have contributed more to carbon emissions in the past, do they owe additional funds through a framework called loss and damage to developing countries? And the other issue is also, how do we verify and monitor and communicate from one country to another, and also to the larger UNFCCC, about if we've made progress or not, and against both mitigation and adaptation goals. That it's an idea that's called the Paris Rulebook, that there should be a way to kind of evaluate the national claims. These are supposed to be hard. These are really important and challenging issues, and I'm not surprised that they took extra time. But progress did occur. You know, there has been some discussion about whether or not the rule book could have been more robust. I'm sure it could, but it also, I think there's an assumption that it's supposed to, more rules and more stringent rules should evolve over time, but we have something going forward. A lot of the issues about loss and damage, I think, are ongoing. And water is really critical on both sides of that debate. Just this morning, I was chatting with some colleagues about how we might be able to prepare a set of criteria to be able to judge the efficacy of national adaptation plans or national commitments to the UNFCCC that try to recognize some of these deep interconnections of water for mitigation and adaptation, so that when they present these plans, they actually have been kind of water vetted, and that we have some good sense, again, a kind of comparative sense about what might really be useful and effective. That we know that these are solid commitments, they can be met, and that the countries are comfortable standing behind them.
OOSKAnews will certainly to continue to watch this fascinating space, and as ever, we really value your input, John Matthews. It's a pleasure talking to you as always, and I thank you for your time and look forward to the next time.
Thanks so much, David. I really appreciate the connection.
Great. Bye for now.
Bye.